All right, welcome to the deep dive. We had a listener write in wanting to know more about where India stands globally when it comes to women in parliament. They mentioned a list of 193 countries.
Okay.
So let's dive into that. We've been looking into the data from the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union,
Right.
and as of March 1st, 2025, they have data on 183 countries. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Basically, the goal here is to see how India stacks up, both in the world as a whole and then also within its own region.
Yeah, and it's really important to start with just acknowledging that globally, women are still vastly underrepresented in decision-making positions. And that includes, of course, political life. I mean, achieving gender parity in politics is a huge challenge everywhere. And we've seen that progress towards that has been pretty slow globally. It's interesting to note, though, that there are a handful of countries that have actually hit or even surpassed that 50% mark for women in their single or lower house of parliament. This is as of March 2025, so that includes places like Rwanda, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Andorra, and the UAE.
Wow, that's actually more than I would have guessed.
Yeah, it's promising to see some movement for sure. But for context, the global average last year in 2024 was only about 27.2%.
Yeah.
So, there are also really big regional differences. The Americas have actually seen the most significant increase over the past few decades. They're averaging about 35.4%. But then on the other hand, you have places like Asia, where growth has been much slower.
So it's clearly not just about, time passing. Something else is going on.
Right, exactly. And I think those countries that are consistently at the top, like Rwanda and Cuba, that really suggest that, specific policy interventions like those legislated gender quotas that I mentioned can really make a difference.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, that global picture, where does India fit in all this?
Right, so if we're going by the IPU data, as of March 1st, 2025, India is ranked 152nd out of 183 countries.
Okay,
So that's for the proportion of women in their national parliament.
152.
Yeah, and if you look at the numbers,
Hmm.
more specifically in the Lok Sabha, that's the House of the People, women hold 13.8% of the seats,
Okay.
which translates to 75 out of 544 seats. And then in the Rajya Sabha, the Council of States, it's slightly higher. It's 16.7%.
Yeah.
So that's 39 out of 234.
So there is a little bit of a difference between the two houses.
Yes, a bit of a difference there.
But still, India being, the world's largest democracy, and with so many women voters, this ranking of 152 does seem pretty low.
Yeah, and I think it really highlights this disconnect between, women's participation as voters and then their actual representation as elected officials.
Right, that's a big gap. So how does this compare to, like, India's neighbors?
Okay, so within South Asia, you see some variation. For example, Nepal had a significantly higher representation, 33.5% in 2024.
Wow.
And Bangladesh was also higher, about 20.9% as of 2023.
Yeah.
Pakistan, on the other hand, was just slightly ahead of India's Lok Sabha numbers with about 17% last year. And then, you have Sri Lanka, which actually had lower representation than India at about 9.8% in 2024.
Huh. So it seems like, Nepal and Bangladesh doing so much better, that must be tied to something they're doing differently.
Yeah, it's very possible that their higher representation is due to things like reserved seats or those quotas for women in their electoral systems. We were talking about those earlier. But it's also interesting that, India and Pakistan, despite being, very different contexts in many ways, they have similar levels of representation. So, that might be pointing to some shared regional challenges that need to be addressed.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what about, zooming out again, what about those countries that are consistently at the top? Like what are they doing right?
Well, we mentioned Rwanda earlier. They consistently do really well, 64%. And then Cuba at 56%, Nicaragua at 55%. And then you also have the Nordic countries, right? You've got Denmark at 43.6%, Finland at 46%, Norway around 46.2%. And for Sweden, the latest data we have is from 2018, and they were at 47.3%.
Wow. So clearly, different regions, different approaches, but high representation is possible.
Absolutely. And I think, when you look at those examples, it brings us back to the question of, well, what are the factors that are really influencing these numbers? Rwanda, for example, their success is often attributed to that very deliberate implementation of gender quotas in their constitution, which happened after the genocide.
Hmm.
And then with the Nordic countries, it's likely a combination of things, right? Supportive sociopolitical environments, active policies from their political parties, things like that. And then when you look at India, there are some pretty significant barriers that women face when it comes to political participation. And these, they're deep-rooted, complex issues. You have sociocultural barriers, things like patriarchal attitudes, traditional gender roles that really limit women, mostly to domestic responsibilities. And then you have, the lack of sustained political will, which I think is evidenced by the whole long journey of the Women's Reservation Bill.
Oh, yeah, that's been going on for decades now, hasn't it?
It has. And then, of course, there are economic inequalities.
Yeah.
Financial constraints can be huge challenges for women who want to contest elections. And then, unfortunately, you can't ignore the violence and threats that women in politics often face.
Yeah.
That can really deter a lot of women from even considering running for office.
It's really disheartening.
Yeah, it's a serious issue.
Yeah.
And then you also have, the reluctance of political parties to really fully support women candidates, despite, often their stated commitments to do so. And this often translates to not giving women enough nominations, especially for seats that are actually winnable. And, all these challenges, they're especially tough for women from marginalized communities. And then, you also have to consider the lack of strong internal democracy within a lot of political parties, which can really limit women's ability to kind of rise within the ranks and gain those leadership positions.
Right, so many layers to this. But what about that new law, the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam, the one passed in 2023? That seemed like a pretty big deal. It reserves a third of the seats for women in the Lok Sabha and in state assemblies, and also in the Delhi Assembly.
Yes, it's definitely a significant step. A lot of people are very hopeful about its potential impact. However, the actual implementation of that law is going to depend on the next census, which hasn't happened yet, and then the subsequent delimitation of constituencies, which basically means redrawing the electoral districts. That's because you have to ensure that each district has roughly the same population, and then within those new boundaries, you have to identify which seats are going to be the reserved ones.
Right.
So some estimates suggest that this whole process might not be finished until around 2028. So that means, the impact on global rankings, we might not actually see that until after the 2029 general elections, which is, quite a ways off. And of course, there has been some criticism of the bill as well. Some people are concerned about its potential impact on the representation of women from the other backward classes, the OBCs. And there are also questions about, its broader implications for electoral dynamics.
It's never simple, is it?
Right. It's very complex. But one thing to keep in mind is that India does have some experience with this type of affirmative action because they've already reserved seats for women in their local government bodies. Those are called Panchayati Raj institutions. And that experience has actually shown that this kind of reservation policy can really significantly increase women's participation at that grassroots level.
Interesting. So historically speaking, where has India been on this, in terms of numbers?
Well, if we look back, since India gained independence, the representation of women in the Lok Sabha has been, really quite low. It kind of hovered around 5% up until the 1970s. It didn't even reach double digits until 2009, when it hit 11%. And the highest proportion they've had so far was in the 2019 general elections, and even then it was only about 15%.
So very slow progress.
Yes, very slow. And in the Rajya Sabha, the representation has generally been a bit lower than in the Lok Sabha. Actually, it's never gone above 13% of the total membership since 1951.
Remind me, when was the first woman even elected to the Indian parliament?
That was in 1952.
1952. So really this slow pace of increase over 7 decades now that just underscores how deeply rooted these barriers are. And it also, I think, highlights how important it is to have impactful interventions like this new bill.
I agree. And the slight variations we see between the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, those are also interesting. They could be indicating different dynamics that are at play in each house. So just to recap for our listener who wrote in, as of March 1st, 2025, India is ranked 152nd out of 183 countries when it comes to women's representation in parliament.
Right.
The Lok Sabha is at 13.8% women. The Rajya Sabha a bit higher at 16.7%. But both of those are below the global average and also lower than some of India's neighbors in South Asia. And we talked about how this underrepresentation is really due to this, complex interplay of social, cultural, political, economic factors and also instances of violence against women in politics.
Absolutely. It's a very multifaceted issue.
And, the Women's Reservation Bill, it really does offer some hope for the future.
Yeah.
But like you said, its full impact, it's going to take some time because the census and delimitation processes that have to happen.
Yes, definitely.
But I think, ultimately achieving greater gender parity in India's parliament, it's really crucial. It's crucial for strengthening their democracy, ensuring that their governance is more inclusive, and of course, for empowering women throughout the country. So the reservation bill is a very important step. But it's clear that, continued efforts to address those underlying societal and structural barriers, those are going to be essential. And that's really going to be key to realizing the bill's full potential and actually moving India up in those global rankings.
So I'll leave our listeners with this.
Yeah.
What else beyond just legislation do you think could help accelerate the progress of women in Indian politics? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, and one that deserves a lot more discussion.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And until next time.
See you then.